Hi and welcome. In 2015, it is 100 years ago since a large part of our population were murdered and subjected to the first modern and systematic genocide. The consequences of this genocide, which we call SAFO, has daily done and makes itself felt. It is a current theme among our people. Many young and old, women and men, are talking about SAFO in different contexts. It has affected many people in their everyday lives. However, few people have general knowledge of what happened during this disastrous years, 1915, and the years following that. Also, the Swedish Parliament voted in 2010 for the recognition of SAFO as a genocide. Other parliaments have later voted for recognition. Opponents have always pointed out that the reason why they could not recognize SAFO as a genocide was that there was no literature or evidence about what happened during the genocide. To remedy this, David Gaunt, professor in history, have written the book Massacres, Resistance Protectors. To discuss this book, we have invited Hubert Roslund, who will read the book. Welcome, Hubert. You're actually one of the few who have actually read this book.
Thank you, Konstantin. It's always an honor to participate in Assyria TV.
You're welcome. Let me begin with the first question that I have in this program. And is this an important book? And if so, why?
Yes, it's a very important book. SAFO is one of the most extreme events in modern history for many reasons. Mm. First of all, the loss rates, i.e. the percentage of the population who was actually killed, is enormous. We're talking about 50, 70, 90% of the population, depending on how much control the Ottoman Empire had over that region. Mm. So the loss rates are enormous. Secondly, it's incredibly brutal. A large part of the civilian population participated in this genocide, and it was almost a competition in terms of who can be most violent and who can do the most cruel things. Mm. So it didn't happen. It wasn't an industrialized genocide far away from anyone's views. Mm. This happened in and around the cities in southeastern Turkey, what is today Turkey, and there were corpses everywhere. And the third factor is that it's still being denied. Mm. The Assyrians and the Syriacs have no country, no autonomous region, and it's still being denied by some people. Mm. So previously, the Armenian genocide had been proven beyond any doubt. But this book, if we can show the David Gaunt's books, this book does a lot to prove the genocide of the Assyrians, Syriacs and Chaldeans during this period. It's an incredibly tough read, but once you've read it, it's very difficult to say something along the lines that the genocide never happened. Mm, mm.
I mean, this denying of genocide, which are the most common ways of denying this genocide as we see today?
It basically depends on the audience. So, okay. If the people who want to deny it suspect that the audience has very little knowledge, then they will basically say that it never happened. It never happened. And I've heard that myself. For instance, met Kurds who thought that the Armenian church, one of the holiest in Agtamar outside Van, was actually built by the old Turks, because that's what they had heard in school.
In Turkey?
In Turkey.
Yeah.
Other sort of ways of denying the genocide is to say, well, there was a civil war and people died, and it's sad, but people died in the war. And the third one, when they suspect that you have even more knowledge, is to say, yes, it was ethnic cleansing, but it was actually only meant as such, only. So the idea was to deport people through the desert, down to Deir ez-Zor and such places, and for them to arrive. And unfortunately, things got out of hand, and criminals attacked the people, and therefore they died. Then you have a few more exotic deniers. I heard one about there having been an earthquake that only hit the Christians and left the Muslims alone. So.
Okay. Interesting. This book, what made you read this book?
I mean, it's really a great interest in understanding how come any of these ancient Christian populations of origin made it through. How could any of them survive? I mean, still survive in Turabdin, or make it across to Qamishli or Hasaki in modern Syria. You know, how did they survive? And I talked to many Assyrians and Syriacs and Chaldeans here in Stockholm before reading this book, and many of them had a very vague concept themselves. They didn't quite know, and the ones who had theories are actually theories that David Gaunt's book disprove, more or less.
Interesting that you're saying that, but why do you think that the level of knowledge among Assyrians of what happened, why do you think it is in that way? Is it maybe because of the reality, or maybe the Kurds and the Turks was even more brutal against the Assyrians? Is it a possible way of making such an I mean, is it a possible way to...
I see your point, but I don't believe that is the answer, because you know, what happened to the Armenians and the Assyrians and the Chaldeans was basically the same. It can't be more horrible. So the Armenians suffered just as bad, just the same kind of cruel treatment. So whatever it is, it's not that.
And wrong theories among Assyrians. Why is that?
Well, I mean, obviously the population had been decapitated. So the intellectuals and the leaders were gone, mostly. And the other people had to try to start a new life from fresh. Many of them had paid all their money as protection or lost it. So they had to start a new life, either in Turabdin or in Syria, which was then under France. And they had to just start life from fresh. Also, this kind of discussion was discouraged in those areas at that time. So, you know, Armenia ultimately got an own country. I mean, it's threatened and so on, but they've got a country. So there nowadays, they can support this kind of research to a level that...
Well, you also have this factor that it's a shame maybe to talk about something like this. We have seen documentaries actually pointing at that. Well, Hubert, I mean, we know that there is some books, some reports, some articles about this genocide. In your way of seeing it, in what way is this book written by David Gaunt different from earlier books about the genocide against the Assyrians?
The earlier books were mainly written, like this one, for instance, by Suleiman Hinno, which is in Swedish, unfortunately. Was mainly documenting the witness statements made by the survivors. And that's very important. It's incredibly important, but it focuses on a small area in Midyat mainly.
What's the Turabdin area?
Yes. Yeah. So what David Gaunt's book does, and perhaps if we can see that on screen, is to, first of all, he's not Assyrian himself.
No.
So he's got a slightly less emotional language, even if the witness statements are equally disturbing. He also uses a much wider range of sources and a longer time period and a wider geographic area, and also looks at some of the geopolitical components. So he covers more, and that helps to illustrate what is happening.
I noticed that you said a wider range of sources. Could you give some examples of what you mean by this wider range of sources for the audience to understand better.
I mean, David Gaunt still uses a lot of the eyewitness statements from survivors.
Yeah.
But he also adds a lot of other sources. So, for instance, Russian militaries and Russian officials who were often early at the scene on some of the front lines. He also uses American missionaries, French missionaries, and I've got actually one of the qualities of Gaunt's book is that it makes it very easy to find these sources. So I brought one of the book that I've read afterwards, which is written by a French monk, Jacques Rétoré, who spent a lot of time, most of his adult life, in Mesopotamia, and to learn the languages and to understand the cultures. And when the war started, he was interned in Mardin and spent some time in Mardin.
So he was there during these events?
Yes. And he was there, he could speak the languages, he could record it, and he's made a very, very strong statement about that. David Gaunt also uses other sources. So, for instance, Persian or Iranian foreign minister or governors who are protesting about the treatment of the Christians. He's using a mercenary from Venezuela who is an officer in the Ottoman army and who writes about all the things he sees and all the crimes that the Ottoman army commits. And David Gaunt also uses an Arab, son of a sheikh from southern Syria, former mayor in one of the departments in the Ottoman Empire, who happens to be in Diyarbakir during what happens and writes down a very terrible account. And that's, if we can see that on screen as well, Martyred Armenia, written by Faisal al-Husseini. And so there's a very wide range, including German sources, Turkish sources, and so on.
So, I mean, what you're saying actually is that we have sources from Arabs, Persians, French, mercenaries from Venezuela, even Turks and Germans. So it's a wide range of sources. And the time perspective, why is that so important?
Well, the time perspective before the war, before 1914, is important to understand how we get to the genocide, and also to understand why some Christians did not see it coming, especially in the bigger cities. The time period at the start of the war is important to understand that it was planned, and also that different areas had different time to react. Some of them just didn't have a chance. Others had some time to react. And the wider geographic area, if we can see the map on screen, please. The map shows that we're covering a much wider region. We're covering the front lines in Hakkari and in Urmia in Persia.
At the border with Persia?
With the Persian Empire.
Yeah.
But we're also covering areas like Diyarbakir, which is far, far, far from the front. So you cannot say that this was,
many days of riding by horse to come to do Omid Diyarbakir.
But you can't claim that that was a war zone.
No.
So all of that is important.
Okay, so I mean, what I'm catching from you is that we have a period before the war, during the war, and hopefully after the war. So if you could, guide us through this period as good as you can, and hopefully the book will do its.
Yes. Yeah. So the ancient Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire never had a very easy ride. So they always had less, especially in the later days, they had less rights. And from time to other, there were massacres in various areas. And in the 1840s, in 1843 and 1846, there were Kurdish rebellions under Nur Allah and Badr Khan in Hakkari on the border to Persia, and which claimed a lot of victims among the Assyrians.
Okay.
They obviously tried to defend themselves, but still victims. That caused a major uproar abroad, who claimed that the Turkish or Ottoman authorities did nothing to stop, either supported it or did nothing to stop the massacres. Fast forward to 1870s, and the Ottoman Empire loses a war against Russia. And if we can see the map again on screen, then in the upper right corner, we've got an area with stripes.
Yeah.
So basically, Turkey loses that part, Kars, Ardahan, etc.
Yeah.
And they would have lost even more. But other European powers who don't want Russia to get too strong,
Okay.
they call for a Berlin conference,
Okay.
and where Russian gains are slightly less. However, as a compromise, 6 Armenian vilayets are formed, or provinces.
Okay.
And in those provinces, on the map, that's the lighter areas. Those areas would give the Christians more rights. So the idea was that they would have some kind of co-leading right in those areas, just as had happened on the Mount Lebanon further south, when the Ottomans had massacred Christians and foreign powers demanded that the Maronites should be given some rights.
Because the majority in these vilayets were Christians.
In some of them, but it wasn't easy because some of the big Christian areas were also outside, like Trebisonde. So this was one attempt.
Okay.
And in some of them you had Muslim majority, but it depended.
Okay.
Now, these reforms were never implemented. And when we get to the 1890s, you have a series of massacres. The biggest one of them is the Hamidiyya massacres. And that affects a lot of the areas on this map, with red marks on them. And that claimed hundreds of thousands of dead in Constantinople and out in the regions. But it didn't affect the non-Armenian Christians very much. And that's important for what we're going to see. So there are, in this book, there are incidents described where the Turkish police or Kurdish militias actually protect Christians in the Mardin area, for instance. They stop massacres. And so the Christians see that as long as we keep good relations with other people locally, we might be okay.
They were following a pattern then?
Yes.
Maybe.
But in 1909, if we can look at the map again, we had the Adana massacres. And the Adana is on the Turkish south coast. So in the Adana, if you look at the map, then those massacres were more focused on all Christians in that particular area. They didn't spread, but they were very vicious. And they captured Armenians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, everything.
No difference between
them.
No
difference. And that's the first time in modern time that you see that kind of pattern.
This was 1909?
09, yes. Okay. And that's very important because if the Christians had seen Adana as the model, they would have tried to protect themselves.
Okay.
But with the Hamidiyya massacres, some were led to believe that if we just cooperate, then nothing will happen. After that, Turkey lost rapidly 3 wars. One against Italy in Libya, and 2 on the Balkans against Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro and Greece. And they lost most of their holdings in Europe then. So that sort of leads it up to the war. And then just before, in 1913 and 14, you had a string of Kurdish risings or rebellions in southeastern Turkey. So it was a difficult time.
And this is pre-war then?
This is pre-war.
Yeah. So I mean, take us through the events coming after that. I mean, preparations, what happens in the ground and so on. What do you have? What does David Gaunt write about that?
I mean, first of all, the plan appears to have been to assimilate, to forcefully deport Christian minorities from where they live to other parts of the country, blend them, forcefully assimilate them. They're not allowed to be more than 10% in any area. That was as good as they could do in peacetime. So they started to move Greek from the west coast to other parts, just not to have any concerns. And they issued orders to do the same for the Assyrians in Hakkari. Now in August 1914, the war starts. And
in Europe.
Yeah. The First World War. So on one hand, we have Germany, which is Turkey's friend and ally, and Austria-Hungary. And on the other hand, on the other side, we have Russia, France, Britain, Serbia, and Montenegro.
Okay.
And at that time, Turkey is not one of the countries at war, but they're seen as very friendly to Germany. And they mobilize already in August 1914, and they start to prepare the scene. So they start to deport Assyrians from Hakkari, from the border. Persia, importantly, stays neutral. But Russia already has a presence in Persia. So what Turkey starts to do, the Ottoman Empire starts to do, is to send plunderers, send militias and soldiers into Iran to plunder, and also to deport people in Hakkari. So,
and now we are in.
Now we're before the war.
Yeah.
We're in October 1914. We're already starting to see the Assyrian population in the border areas to suffer. Civilians. Then in November 1914, the Germans and the Turks together start a provocation to ensure that the Russians declare war.
Against the Ottomans.
Against the Ottomans.
Yeah.
So a number of German warships with Turkish flags go up the Black Sea and start to bombard Crimea and Odessa.
Which is then Russia. Yeah.
And sure enough, war is started in the beginning of November, and 2 weeks later on, jihad, or holy war, is declared against the infidels. So the war is then declared, but as we can see, the Assyrians in the border areas have already suffered. Now we start to see a battle on two fronts. So if we can see the map on screen again, we'll see that on the one hand, the Russians are making progress on the northern front. The Turks launch a big offensive which fails at Sarakamish, but the Turks also move in towards Iran. And we don't know why the Russians retreat around New Year's Eve 1914 in a rush, either because they overestimate the strength of the Turkish troops, or because they need to move troops to the Western Front. Either way,
they move the area.
They move out of Iran.
Yeah.
And the Christian populations see panic. So some people try in the middle of winter to quickly follow the Russian troops out. Others flee to American or French missionaries and try to seek protection there, which unfortunately doesn't always work. And some stay in the villages. And now comes in, Turkish troops, Kurdish militias, Azeri volunteers, and it becomes very, very brutal. And I've got a few quotes from this book. So, reading now from David Gaunt's book. First of all, we have on page 82, we have the foreign minister of Iran, who protests to the Ottoman Empire about the atrocities committed by the Ottoman troops.
Who's that?
This is the foreign minister Muaven ad-Dawle. And he protests against the acts of violence committed by your soldiers who in the course of battle have pillaged many villages, torched many others, and reduced all of the inhabitants to a state of misery. The violence is most noted in the areas where there are many villages inhabited by Christians, where the population has been violated and mercilessly massacred. Another quote from the Persian governor of Urmia, who under Turkish occupation is powerless.
Okay.
He writes on page 89.
Whose name is? What is his name?
His name is Azim al-Sultani Sardar.
Okay.
And he protests that the Turks had instigated the Mujahideen and the agents of Satan to perpetrate that which may not be written with a pen nor spoken by a tongue. And
horrible.
There's a multitude of witnesses here. We got another one from an American lady who is head of a girls' school.
Please, read.
Who says that this village, Gulpashan, and Iriava had been shielded, partly through the efforts of a German. But on Wednesday night, a band of Persian volunteers, arriving from Salmas or beyond, went there, took 50 men, and according to reports, shot them in the graveyard nearby. They then plundered the village, took girls and young women, outraged them, i.e. raped them, and acted in general as one might expect Satan to do when turned loose.
Horrible.
So we have a long list of witness statements from all types describing that this is something that they hadn't seen before. It was cruelty taken to another level.
And we are talking about the area close to the border against the Persian Empire now.
This is in the Persian Empire.
In the Persian Empire.
So the Turkish troops and the Kurdish militias and so on have entered Persia, no resistance, and basically started to massacre people.
Okay. If we look at the Tur Abdin area, for an example, Mardin, Midyat, what happens there during this time? Yeah.
So what we can see is that over there things have not started to happen really. I mean, it's only in March and April that things start to become more and more difficult, and we can see that in the overall project strategy from the authorities seems to be divide and conquer, and never give all the Christians a possibility to rise at the same time.
Okay.
So they start to call up the men and take them to forced labor battalions so that they can kill them later on. And they try to play Armenians out against Chaldeans, Chaldeans against Assyrians, etc. And also to take it little by little. So people actually believe that they would not be the victims of this policy. And if they were, they would only be deported, but not killed. So we can see how this now starts to happen more and more. And if we can see the map on screen again, then basically in Van, the policy fails. The Armenians realize that they've heard what happens in Urmia, and they realize that when the Turks call for another 4,000 men, they're just going to be slaughtered. So they mount a defense. In Diyarbakir, the strategy succeeds.
The Turkish
strategy succeeds, and they take one group after another. They prison. They put the leaders in prison, they torture them, and then take them on death marches. But everyone is supposed to think that they're going to just be deported.
Yeah, I mean, we know that in April 19, I think, the Turkish authorities arrested Ashur Yusuf, a prominent leader of the Assyrian nation, and actually hang him in April 1915. So, I mean, they not only beginning in Omid, Diyarbakir.
So also we can also see that the villages, some of the villages are starting to be picked off one after another. Death brigades, al-Khamsin, are formed, and also militias, and they surround villages and then they kill, rape, plunder, burn, etc. And this becomes more and more frequent, and it comes closer and closer to the Midyat area. We see Hassan Kaif, Kfar Boran. It comes to the really suburbs around Mardin, where Mardin is on a hill slope, and we have villages like Mansouriya and Goliya just 4 to 8 kilometers away, who are surrounded and burnt. So it's coming closer, and one of the strongest witnesses there is about what happened to Sirte. And that's written by the mercenary from Venezuela I mentioned before.
Yeah, please read.
And his statement is very strong because he had no incentive to write about this. He could have gone home to Venezuela and pretended that he fought for France or Britain. And then lived his life being admired by his neighbors.
Nobody would know.
No one would know.
No.
And instead he wrote this book where it's obvious that he was, supporting indirectly this misery, this genocide. So so his name was Rafael de Nogales.
Which page?
And on page 251, he describes when the Turkish troops are finally defeated in Persia and are retreating first through Hakkari and then to Bitlis and Sirte. He is an officer in the artillery, so he's moving slower than the cavalry. And they go past him, but take the time to tell him about the joyous news. So he says, on the road to Sirte, several officers of the voluntary battalion of Bashkale overtook me and snatched time to explain with an air of great satisfaction how and when the authorities at Bitlis had everything in readiness, merely awaiting Khalil Bey's final order to commence one of the most cowardly massacres in the contemporary history of Armenia. These fellows even advised me to hurry up if I wished to arrive in time to witness the great massacre of Sirte, which by that time must have already commenced under the direction of the Governor-General of the province, Cevdet Bey. And when he says Armenia, this was a split village with a lot of Syriacs and Chaldeans. So Nogales then arrived, and he comments the atrocious spectacle afforded by a hill beside the highway. The ghastly slope was crowned by thousands of half-nude and still bleeding corpses, laying in heaps or interlaced in death's final embrace. Overcome by the hideous spectacle, and jumping our horses over the mountains of cadavers which obstructed our passage, I entered Sirte with my men. There we found the police and the populace engaged in sacking the houses of the Christians. I met various sub-governors of the province, assembled in council under the presidency of the chief of the local gendarmes, Nassim Effendi, who had directed the massacre in person. From their talk I realized at once that the thing had been arranged the day before by Cevdet Bey. So there are a lot of witness statements in these various books about the massacres in Sirte and Bitlis.
Very strong.
About how civilian population who had not made any resistance were just led away and butchered. And under the most brutal forms.
And today the town of Sirte is totally empty of any Christian whatsoever.
Hardly anyone survived, and the few women who survived were often, raped and taken to someone else's house, or had to march through the desert. So very, very few made it there.
So now, basically, Hubert, we are in the year of 1915.
Yes.
And during the spring.
Yeah.
So later, what happens then?
And different areas try different tactics. So one of the Armenian archbishops in Mardin, Maloyan, he tries to really please the authorities, and he's even given a medal by the Sultan.
Okay.
But that doesn't help him.
Because?
The mayor of Mardin is taken out. He's not genocide friendly enough. He's taken out, and the new one doesn't care. So he's one of the people who is imprisoned, tortured, and taken on a death march. So this comes closer and closer, and by now some villages start to resist. But it's very tricky for them, because often the Turkish police, the gendarmes, can come up to the village and say, we're going to protect you against Kurdish militias. But then they actually turn the guns against the village. So a lot of people understand ultimately that they have to defend themselves, but they don't make it. Only a few places like Azakh, who see it coming and start to repair the walls to save ammunition and food, they make it. But a lot of the others don't.
And this is actually villages far from the front line.
Far from the front line.
No ambitions whatsoever in making their own country, making any whatsoever fighting the authorities. They just want to be civilians, have no ambitions of anything else.
Absolutely.
Are submitted to this kind of actions.
Absolutely. And the by this time the German and Austrian authorities are also starting to protest, because this is going way out of any expectations.
And this is their allies.
This is their ally.
Okay.
So, for instance, the German consul in Mosul, he reports that this is not an uprising in that sense. This is a direct consequence of the extreme actions of the Wali of Diyarbakir, Rashid, against Christians in general. They are trying to save their skin.
And this
is a German consul writing that. So they are starting to protest.
Okay.
And we also have a statement from the Arab I mentioned. So perhaps if we can see the book written by the Martyred Armenia book, please. And so he writes, the Syriacs in the province of Midyat were brave men, braver than all the other tribes in these regions. When they heard what had fallen upon their brethren at Diyarbakir and the vicinity, they assembled, fortified themselves in 3 villages near Midyat, and made a heroic resistance, showing courage beyond description. The government sent against them 2 companies of regulars, besides a company of gendarmes, which had been dispatched thither previously. The Kurdish tribes assembled against them, but without result, and thus they protected their lives, honor and possessions from the tyranny of this oppressive government. An imperial irade, or decree, was issued granting them pardon, but they placed no reliance on it and did not surrender, for past experience had shown them that this is the most false government on the face of the earth, taking back today what it gave yesterday.
And this
is an Arab, ex-government official.
No interest whatsoever.
No interest whatsoever. He's writing this statement. So, it's really, it's obvious. They are just going to be massacred. And in fact, one of the French monks, Jacques Rétoré, which I mentioned, he's done statistics. And he's claiming that in the Diyarbakir province, he listed per group of Christians, so Armenian Orthodox, Assyrians, and so on. 144,000 people were killed in that province alone. And to that you should add another more than 50,000 in those deportation columns moving from other parts of Turkey, who were slaughtered in that province. So that Diyarbakir province was a complete killing fields. And the previous writer who we mentioned, Faisal el-Hussein, he also describes this in his book, how as you ride along the road, there are corpses everywhere of women, children, elderly, right up onto the walls of Diyarbakir.
Horrible. And now, Hubert, we are in the spring, maybe pre-summer.
We're starting to become in the summer.
Yeah. And what happens then?
Then happens something very important.
Okay.
The Germans start to protest more and more strongly, and to show some kind of goodwill, it appears, the Turkish authorities send a decree saying that it's only the Armenians who are supposed to be subject of this treatment, not the others.
Okay.
So in principle, the Assyrians and the Syriacs and the Chaldeans should go free now. But they don't.
Or at least be safe.
The ones who have survived.
Yeah.
But that's on the 12th of July. And only 7 days later...
1915.
Only 7 days later start the assault of Midyat. and then in August, we have a lot of really cruel massacres where whole villages or whole cities are killed in Derik, Jazire, Nusaybin, and then Edessa. And apart from Edessa, these cities did not even resist. Some of them tried to pay their way and tried to keep the head down, but it wasn't sufficient. They were killed.
And again, still these cities, villages are far from the
front line. And they were killed long after this decree was issued. So it seems in David Gaunt's book that there was never really the intention that it would stop. It was some kind of face-saving peace in the bigger cities for a while, and then something else would happen. So it's a very... and even the places that did resist, if we're talking about Azach, so David Gaunt's book takes a lot of time to describe what happened in Azach. And there, in the city, they took in Armenian refugees. They did not fall in the trap of divide and conquer. So Armenians, Assyrians, Chaldeans stood united. And they fought off the attack. And they even had special brigades, special suicide battalions who would go out and counterattack.
The Assyrians had that.
And they fought off first the Kurds and then the Turks until a stalemate was reached in November.
Because of?
Well, no one really knows. Was it the German pressure or just the Kurds and the Turks feeling that they had to concentrate on the front line?
No idea fighting Azach.
Yeah. And so then a number of villages survive for them. But that was just the start of it. Because then you have a number of more warriors. And they have to go out and get food once in a while. Or attend to the fields.
Yeah, of course.
And that was very difficult. A lot of them got shot then or died in disease. And one of the strongest stories here was Deiro da Slibo, which resisted the first wave, made it through, just like Ha and Azach and Ain Wardo and many others.
Which is a small village in Sorabdin.
Yeah. But then when they thought everything was safe, there was an armistice in place and things had quieted down, they probably relaxed a little bit too much. The Kurds stormed them, took everyone and burnt them at the stakes.
Alive.
And we're talking in the 20th century. So, they were far from safe at that time. But, that's when the fighting stopped.
I mean, I noted that you said about surviving this Armageddon, this inferno of killings. You said that one of the things that interested you to read this book was how is it possible to survive this kind of events? How is it possible to survive this genocide? I mean, what's your reflection about this? I mean, survival mechanism. How is it possible?
I mean, first of all, the human condition. I mean, some of these peasants in a faraway village, somewhere in a valley or a hillside, had to make life and death decisions in a matter of minutes. They were caught up in a geopolitical scheme they had no idea of. They probably didn't even know there was a war on. And they had to make a life and death decision. Do I trust these people coming and say that they will protect us? Will we fight them or just run?
What's your instincts?
Well, I mean, there was no safe strategy.
No.
Because sometimes they fled, but they fled in the wrong direction and were killed. Or they fled to another village and they tried to be safe there, but or in Hakkari, when people tried to resist. But then as they were driven further up in the mountains in the winter time, they died in drafts. So there is no single one strategy that seems to have worked in all areas. And so you can't say that, you survived because it was a city center, or you survived because there were more foreigners who could see what was happening, or you survived because you had better relations with the local authorities. Nothing of that seemed to work. So in Jazire, for instance, they had good relations. They tried to bribe off the attackers, and it didn't work.
Because of the general plan. It was, I mean, their fate was already planned. There was no room for any Christian whatsoever in the area.
Well, David Gaunt's book is slightly vague on the final solution. I mean, was there a tolerance to have a smaller amount still there, to sort of, you know, but no longer in any big numbers?
No. I mean, genocide, this term is, I mean, legal term, but according to your interpretation of this book, does this book prove that it is a genocide, this SAFO?
In my view, definitely. I mean, the breadth of testimony here. We're talking about, you know, allies, neutrals. You know, it's so vast, and the commonalities are so many. So I think it proves it beyond any doubt. And the numbers here are staggering. I mean, today the term genocide is sometimes used a bit loosely and battered around as a political piece. But here, I mean, it's only this one and the genocide of the Jews in the Second World War that really have these kind of lost numbers.
What kind of percentage are we talking about?
Well, if we're talking about, depends on the area. Obviously, the ones where Turkey never made it to will pull that number down. But we're talking about 50, 60, 70, 90% loss rates. That's similar to the Jews lost in many parts of Europe. They also had safer countries. So the Jews only lost 1% in Denmark because they could flee across to Sweden. And similarly for the Assyrians, in the areas that were really hit hard, very few survived. But then, of course, you had other borderline areas where people could flee. And also, in terms of this genocide argument, David Gaunt has a very interesting point in his book.
Okay.
He tries to turn it around and say, okay, let's assume for a minute that this was not actually a genocide, that it was actually only forced deportation. And the idea was that people would make it safely through the desert.
Okay.
I don't know, Konstantin, have you been in these kind of places in Syria, in Deir ez-Zor?
No, actually, I have not.
No, I have. I mean, it's surrounded by desert and it's for miles and miles and miles.
Okay.
So, what would it take if you actually wanted people to arrive there? Well, in a bureaucracy state like the Ottoman Empire, there would be loads of documents, a vast supply of documents, with telegrams going from one place to another about how many would be coming in this column, how much food and water was required, who would be responsible, where would they seek shelter, when would they move from being the responsibility of one province to the next, and so on and so forth. And there was nothing of that until the very, very final stages, when some people actually started to arrive at the concentration camps. But even then, a lot of those concentration camps in Ras Al Ain, in Deir ez-Zor, were also massacred at many times, wiped out.
Interesting point of view to I mean, analyze the genocide. I mean, today we actually see that we have a lot of huge lobby that is denying this genocide. I mean, why and how is it even possible to deny this genocide? Why do you think that they are denying it? What does David Gaunt write about that?
Well, he doesn't write that much. I think it's difficult to see that. I mean, is it ignorance? Is it misplaced patriotic feelings? Is it monetary incentives or geopolitical blackmail? Well, it differs, but it's very difficult to read these kind of accounts and still be in doubt.
Interesting. I mean, we always talk about Turkey, Kurds, and so on as perpetrators. I mean, who is responsible for this genocide? I mean, this SAFO, who actually, if we had a trial here, who would be the perpetrator? Who would be put in jail for these actions, for this genocide?
I think in reality, it's easy to say who wasn't involved.
Okay.
Because many of these books, in David Gaunt's book, in the other books I'm talking about, they describe how widely this was done, how big a part of the local population who participated in plundering, raping, abducting, murdering, and so on. So it's a very large part of the civilian population who participates, either to make themselves rich or because of religious or nationalistic emotions. And so that one is very difficult to see. I mean, as opposed to the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews, this was not an industrial Holocaust done in a faraway location. This was done in and around the cities and villages, and if you traveled from one area to another, you could see the corpses everywhere.
It was like a mass movement today. I mean,
yeah. So there are a lot of statements about these columns and how they were attacked in the most brutal ways.
And I mean, Turkey as
but coming back to Gaunt's point really is that this could look differently depending on where you are. So in some areas it would be Kurdish militias, in others it would be Chechen, Cherkess or Azeri militants, if we're talking about the Persian front.
Northern parts.
It could be Turkish military, so it could differ a lot. But he places the main responsibility on the Turkish leaders. The Turkish leaders who could have stopped this easily, or at least stopped it at the first signs, but quite to the contrary seemed to encourage it.
I mean,
obviously, the Germans and Austrians share guilt in this because it was their ally, but Gaunt seems to focus mostly on that component.
I mean, they must have some kind of clue. They must have some information about what's happening.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. We're talking about Turkey again. I mean, how did Turkey succeed in this project? How did they succeed in committing this genocide? What's your view?
That's one of the most fascinating questions in a sense, because how do you make sure that the whole state apparatus doesn't leak, that people can protect themselves? So I think they were very successful in sending different messages to different groups. So to the Turks, they talked about a pan-Turkish agenda that we should link up with Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and so on. To the Kurds, they talked about a pan-Islamic agenda. To the Christian populations, they talked about that this was only against saboteurs, against revolutionaries. So if you held your head down and just then you would not be the victim of it. And to the Germans, they said that this was people who tried to sabotage the war effort. So they gave different messages, and they made sure no one could see what was really happening until it was too late.
I mean, it's an evil plan. I mean, talking about the Azeris, the Turkmens as their ethnic people, people against the Kurds. I mean, sharing the same religion, and against the Armenians.
And we have a quote here from the leading politician in Mardin.
Please.
So in Mardin, the sort of more Assyrian-friendly leaders were taken out, and this person
replaced with, of course, one is more for the genocide,
more pro-genocide.
And
he sends a congratulations telegram to Rashid Bey, who's the province governor of Diyarbakir, who's been seen as the leader. And he says, "Let me shake your hand, you who have regained the 6 Armenian vilayets and opened the way to Turkestan and Caucasus." So he clearly sees this as a pan-Turkish agenda.
And this is actually a Turkish citizen writing to the leader of the province of Diyarbakir.
Yes, he's a leading judge, leading politician.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, he knows actually who he's going to write and who he's going to send his congratulations to. Interesting. Hubert, coming to the events of today, I mean, we see Middle East is burning in an inferno, and I mean, the events that took place, I mean, a year ago in August 2014 against the Assyrians in the Nimrud Plains, for instance, are there any similarities with what's happening in the Middle East today and the things that David Gaunt has written about in this book? I mean, what's your point of view of that?
I mean, this book is written prior to the recent events in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So obviously there's no mention of that. But
No.
I would say it's difficult not to compare. It's difficult not to make that comparison.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say this SAFOR, the genocide of the Christians, is the blueprint.
Okay.
There's nothing that ISIS has done that is worse than what we can see here. There's
You really
nothing
mean
they
that?
can do that is more brutal. I mean, the statements here are absolutely appalling. And the only thing ISIS can do is, okay, they can post things on YouTube.
Mm.
People who perpetrated this genocide couldn't. But otherwise, there are no limits to the cruelty here in terms of chopping off heads and killing people in front of their parents and so on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we see horrible things committed today in the YouTube, committed by ISIS. You mean that the things who the Kurds and the Turks committed in 1915 are horrible, more horrible than what we see today?
I mean, it's misery to a point where it's almost pointless to compare. But this seems to be the blueprint. And to an extent, if this mayor of Mardin, the leading politician in Mardin, if he was right that the agenda was to create this pan-Turkish, ethnically clean area, then it was a success. They did it. I mean, clearly there are a few left, but not many. And it caused the Ottoman Empire more pain than they would have liked to, because the war went against them. But nevertheless, they succeeded. And if you see that as a success, it would be difficult to imagine that the leaders today in that region have not carefully studied these events. Because one of the things, as the Ottoman Empire went into Persia, was to send wild people in first, to send militias in who did the worst stuff, and then they could come in and say, oh, we're going to normalize events.
The
and
peacekeeping force coming in.
Or a safe buffer zone or something.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you can see some similarities to northern Syria today.
And of course, we see now, as well as Iraq, that the Turkish army is sending in troops to areas around Mosul. Terrible things happening there. Hubert, what's the final view about this book? What's your final view about this book? Please share it with us.
I mean, I think it's a very important book. I've read 8 books on this topic this year because of it being 2015. And this is an incredibly important book. It makes it easy for you to go to the sources and read more. And a lot of these books, like Jacques Rétoré, I had not discovered without David Gaunt's help. So it's a very important one. It's a very tough read. It's really, sometimes you feel physically sick when you read it because the events are so atrocious. But if it's one book you're going to read in 2016, I would say make it this one. The only tiny pieces of criticism I would have is that there is no good map in it. And that makes it a little bit more difficult because the modern maps don't have the same names. Of course, all the Assyrian names have been wiped off the map. So the map is slightly dodgy, and also there's no clear timeline. He has structured it around province by province or area by area, which means you have to make an effort yourself and try to write it down. And of course that integrates the learning more. So in one way it's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot undo that. I mean, I have a person actually who have read this book. What do you take with you from this book? I mean, what should one expect from the youth today? I mean,
I think
this is a legacy that they have.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just the human condition. I mean, here events who are slowly getting worse, and then they just fall off a cliff. And what would you have done? What can be done? What is a good strategy? it's best never to get in that kind of situation, of course. For the Assyrian and Syriac youth in particular, I would say that this is a very, very strong heritage. I mean, your ancestors who have made it possible for you to sit here today, they have stood up through massacres, through genocides. They have refused to convert. They've somehow made it through into Rabdin or across the border to Qamishli or Hasakeh, and somehow they've made it through. And this, for the Assyrian youth today, should serve as inspiration. I mean, did they make all of that sacrifice for you to forget them? No. You should feel gratitude, remembrance, and inspiration. I mean, this incredible heritage should give you inspiration to lead a good life and an honest life, because otherwise it's almost treason to their lives.
With those words, I want to thank you, Hubert, because you wanted to come to Assyria TV and to share your reflections after reading this book. Thank you.
Thank you.
First and foremost, I want to thank David Gaunt, professor in history, for this book. I'm sure that writing this book has required much time and energy, as it is heavily subjected with reports that contains one horrible story after another, with much death and misery. Some of you surely are asking, what's the point of writing and reviewing such a book? I mean, surely there is a lot of answer of that. Why at all doing such a program about SAFO? The answer to that is simple as obvious. This part of history is, I mean, our history. The reason is to the young people to know and learning about this history, this dark period of our history, and to prepare their future in a better way. It is also important to emphasize that learning our history is associated with responsibility, which means that no one should stigmatize or blaming somebody to these atrocities, this genocide whatsoever. However, an innocent people, regardless of nationality, who is denying SAFO, who is denying this genocide, turns to a moral accomplice with the criminals from the genocide 1915 in the moment that he is denying the genocide in 1915. No matter if it happens 100 years ago or if it's happening today in 2015, the idea of denying is, repulsive. I mean, how is it possible even to deny something like SAFO as a genocide? Finally, I can only hope that the governments in the world dare up to stand with their ideals and recognize SAFO as genocide. Thank you for watching this program.